The moment I realized my own husband was poisoning me was the day I stopped being invisible. I felt the chills crawl up my spine as I stared at the glass of pills he'd handed me. With the label changed, the pills inside swapped. That morning changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the man I'd shared my bed with for 32 years. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been living in a small apartment in Queens, New York, where the sounds of the city never sleep and the smell of distant dreams mixes with exhaust fumes and hope. Every morning, I'd wake up in our cramped bedroom, the thin walls barely containing the noise from our neighbors, the sirens, the constant hum of life that never pauses. I'd reach for that little brown bottle on my nightstand, the one with my heart medication, the pills that were supposed to keep me alive, keep my irregular heartbeat steady, keep me functioning for another day. The window stayed cracked open just enough for the autumn breeze to carry in the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from the street vendor 3 floors below. That smell used to comfort me, reminding me of better times when my son was small, and we'd walk through Central Park, sharing warm nuts from paper bags. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. My days had become a muted blur of exhaustion and confusion. I'd swallow those pills every morning, trusting they would help, but instead of feeling better, I felt worse. My heart would race at odd moments, then slow to an almost frightening crawl. I'd get dizzy standing up from my kitchen chair. The taste in my mouth was always slightly bitter, metallic, wrong. I blamed age. I blamed stress. I blamed everything except the one thing I should have suspected from the beginning. The morning my world cracked open started like any other. I shuffled to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the linoleum cold under my feet despite the small space heater we kept running. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the air with the only warmth our tiny kitchen could offer. My husband Richard sat at our small table, reading the newspaper with that same distant expression he'd worn for years. "Morning, Margaret," he said without looking up. "Morning," I whispered back, my voice hoarse from another restless night. I reached for my pills, just like every other morning. Richard watched me from the corner of his eye, something I'd grown used to. He'd started paying attention to my medication routine about 6 months earlier, claiming he was worried about my health. Sweet, I thought then. Caring. But that morning, my son David burst through our front door. He'd been staying across town, working double shifts at the construction site, sending most of his paycheck to help us with rent and groceries. At 28, David had inherited my stubborn love and his father's strong jaw, but his eyes held a kindness Richard had lost somewhere along the way. "Mom." David's voice was urgent, breathless. He must have run up 3 flights of stairs. "Mom, we need to talk. Now." Richard's newspaper crackled as he turned the page. "Your mother's busy, son." But David ignored him. He grabbed my arm gently, his calloused hand warm and familiar. "Mom, run," he whispered in my ear, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "The pills. They're not right." My blood turned to ice water. David had been at our apartment the night before, helping me organize some old medical papers. While I was in the bathroom, he'd noticed something about my medication bottle. "The label looked slightly off," he said. "The pills inside didn't match what the prescription should have contained." That morning, he'd taken a picture of my bottle and compared it to the original prescription he'd helped me fill months ago. The pills were different, completely different. I stared at Richard, who continued reading his paper as if nothing had happened. The man who'd promised to love and protect me. The man who'd held me when I cried after my mother's funeral. The man who'd celebrated with me when David graduated high school. The man who'd been slowly poisoning me for months. How do you process betrayal that deep? How do you look at someone you've shared 32 years with and realize they've been destroying you from the inside out? I excused myself to the bathroom, my legs shaking. David followed, whispering urgently about getting me to a doctor, about getting help, about calling the police. But all I could think about was the weight of the pills in my stomach. How many wrong pills had I swallowed? How many mornings had I trusted the man I loved to keep me alive while he was actually killing me? The photos on our living room wall suddenly looked different. Our wedding day in 1991, young and smiling outside the small courthouse in Brooklyn. Richard in his best suit, me in my mother's blue dress. David's first day of school, gap-toothed and proud. Our vacation to Niagara Falls when money was so tight we shared one hotel room and ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Were those memories real? Or had I been living with a stranger all along? I need to tell you why this happened. Why a man would poison his wife. Why someone would systematically destroy the person who'd given them everything. It wasn't sudden. Evil rarely is. For 32 years, I'd been the foundation of our family. When Richard lost his job at the shipping company in 2009, I worked 2 jobs to keep our heads above water. I cleaned office buildings at night and worked at a small grocery store during the day. My hands cracked from the cleaning chemicals, my back ached from mopping endless floors, but we survived. When David needed money for community college, I gave him my savings from years of skip meals and secondhand clothes. When Richard's mother got sick, I took care of her for 3 years, changing her sheets, cooking her meals, holding her hand during the long nights. "You'll never understand if you don't put in the effort," Richard used to say when I'd ask for help around the house. "You're being dramatic, just tired," when I'd mention how overwhelmed I felt. I remember one night, maybe 2 years ago, I was so exhausted I could barely stand. I'd worked a double shift at the grocery store, come home to cook dinner, clean up, help David with some paperwork for his job applications. I asked Richard if he could just help me fold the laundry. "Just do as you're told," he said, not even looking up from the television. "There's no time for weakness." That was the moment something inside me began to die. Not dramatically, not with tears or anger, just a quiet dimming, like a light bulb slowly burning out. I began to wonder if my love was just fuel for their convenience, if I was nothing more than a ghost haunting my own home, visible only when they needed something. But still, I stayed. Still, I loved. Still, I trusted. Even when Richard started controlling our small finances more tightly. We didn't have much: my Social Security, his disability payments, David's occasional help. But Richard insisted on managing everything. "You're not good with money," he'd say. "Let me handle it." Even when he started isolating me from the few friends I had left. "Rosa downstairs talks too much," he'd complain. "Mrs. Chen from the grocery store is nosy. You don't need them filling your head with nonsense." Even when my own health started failing and he seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Another doctor's visit? Another prescription? Do you know what this costs us?" The signs were there. The warning bells were ringing. But when you love someone, when you've built your entire identity around caring for them, you learn to silence those bells. You learn to make excuses. You learn to disappear. I disappeared so gradually that I didn't even notice I was gone. Do you know what it feels like to be invisible in your own life? To watch yourself shrinking smaller and smaller until you're not even sure you exist anymore? But that morning, when David whispered "run" in my ear, something flickered back to life inside me. Some buried part of myself that remembered what it felt like to matter. The pills in my hand suddenly felt like weapons. The microaggressions had been building for years, small cuts that bled out my self-worth drop by drop. Birthdays that passed without acknowledgement. "Forgot again," Richard would say with a shrug. "You know I'm bad with dates." When I got sick with bronchitis last winter, coughing so hard I couldn't sleep, Richard complained about the noise keeping him awake. No offers to make tea, no suggestions to see a doctor, no gentle hands on my forehead checking for fever. just irritation that my illness was inconvenient. "You're always sick these days," he said one morning, his coffee mug clicking against the table with finality. "Maybe if you took better care of yourself?" I stared at him, wanting to remind him that I'd worked myself to exhaustion taking care of everyone else for 3 decades, that my body was breaking down from the weight of everyone else's needs. But I stayed silent. I always stayed silent. The loneliness was unbearable. Sitting in the same room with the man I'd married, feeling more alone than if I'd been stranded on a desert island. At least on a desert island, I'd know why I was isolated. Then came the day David came home early from work, sick with a stomach bug. He found me on the kitchen floor crying after. The teacup lay shattered around me in brown ceramic pieces. I couldn't even remember dropping it. I just remember the sound it made, sharp and final, like something important breaking forever. "Mom, what's wrong?" David knelt beside me, his work clothes still dusty from the construction site. "Nothing," I whispered. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I was disappearing. I was dying from the inside out, and nobody seemed to notice or care. That night, I sat at my small vanity table, staring at myself in the cracked mirror. When had I gotten so old? When had my skin grown so thin and pale? When had my eyes lost their light? I opened the top drawer and pulled out an old shoebox filled with photographs. Pictures of David as a baby, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger. Pictures of Richard and me before life grew hard, before love became obligation, before trust became a luxury I couldn't afford. I packed them away. I couldn't bear to look at those ghosts of happiness anymore. That's when I began to contemplate doing something I'd never done before. Saying no. The possibility terrified me more than staying in this slow-motion suicide. What if they abandoned me completely? What if I ended up alone, with no one to care if I lived or died? But what was the alternative? Continue disappearing until there was nothing left? I stared at myself in that mirror until the early morning light crept through our thin curtains. I touched the deep lines around my eyes, the gray roots showing through my fading brown hair. I looked like a woman who'd forgotten how to live. Could I remember? Was it too late? The next few days passed in a strange haze. I went through my routines, taking my pills, making breakfast, cleaning, cooking, but everything felt different, like I was watching myself from outside my own body, waiting for something to break. Richard seemed to sense my shift. He became more attentive, bringing me my pills with a glass of water, asking about my doctor's appointments with what seemed like genuine concern. "You know I worry about you," he said one evening, his hand on my shoulder. "I just want you to be healthy and happy." But David's words echoed in my head. "The pills. They're not right." I started paying closer attention. The pills did taste different than I remembered. My symptoms didn't match what they should have been. Instead of feeling better, I felt worse, confused, dizzy, weak. One afternoon, while Richard was out, David came over with printed papers from the internet, information about my heart medication, about what it should look like, about what it should do. "Mom, look at this," he said, spreading the papers on our small kitchen table. "These pills you've been taking, they're not even close to what you're supposed to have." The evidence was devastating. The real pills were white and round. The ones I'd been taking were bluish and oval. The real pills should have made me feel more energetic, more stable. The ones I'd been taking were making me sicker. "He's been poisoning you, Mom." David's voice broke. "Dad's been slowly killing you." The words hung in our tiny kitchen like smoke from a fire, choking and inescapable. How do you confront someone about attempted murder? How do you look at the person you've shared a bed with for 32 years and ask them why they're trying to kill you? That evening, I decided to find out. Richard came home from his weekly poker game, smelling like cigarettes and disappointment. He moved through our apartment like he owned it, like I was just another piece of furniture he had to navigate around. "Richard," I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in months. "We need to talk." He glanced at me with mild irritation. "About what?" I held up the pill bottle. "About these." And for just a second, maybe less than a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Fear? Calculation? Guilt? Then it was gone, replaced by his usual dismissive expression. "What about them?" "They're not my pills." "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret. Of course they are." David checked. "These aren't my heart medication. These are something else entirely." Richard's jaw tightened. "David doesn't know what he's talking about. You're imagining things, Mother." Mother. He'd started calling me that instead of my name about a year ago, like I'd stopped being his wife and become just an elderly burden he was stuck caring for. "I'm not imagining anything," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I want to know what these pills are, and why you've been giving them to me instead of my real medication." The mask slipped. For just a moment, I saw the real Richard. Cold, calculating, angry at being caught. "If you must know," he said, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. "The real pills were too expensive. These are generic. They do the same thing, just cheaper. Lies. Even if I hadn't known the truth, I would have known he was lying. The way he couldn't meet my eyes, the way his hands fidgeted with his coffee mug, the way his voice got slightly higher. But I knew the truth. These weren't cheaper versions of my medication. They weren't medication at all. They were something else, something that was slowly destroying my body from the inside out. "Why?" I whispered. He looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes will haunt me forever. Not love, not concern, not even guilt. Just cold calculation and barely concealed resentment. "You're expensive," he said simply. "The doctor visits, the prescriptions, the constant complaining. Do you have any idea what it costs to keep you alive?" The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "And the insurance money would help," he continued, as if he was discussing the weather. "Life insurance isn't much, but it's something. Plus, I'd finally have the apartment to myself. 32 years of marriage, 32 years of love, sacrifice, devotion, reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. He was killing me for the insurance money and the peace of mind of not having to deal with an aging wife. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that the man I'd loved, the father of my child, had been systematically poisoning me for months. "Don't look at me like that," Richard said, standing up and moving toward me. "You act like you're some kind of saint, but you're just a burden, an expensive, needy burden that I'm tired of carrying." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in our bed, listening to Richard snore beside me, wondering how many nights I'd spent next to my potential murderer. Wondering how I'd been so blind, so trusting, so naive. But something else was growing inside the terror and heartbreak. Something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger. How dare he? How dare this man who'd barely worked in the past decade, who'd lived off my labor and sacrifice, who'd taken every ounce of love and devotion I had to give. How dare he decide I wasn't worth keeping alive? I thought about David, asleep across town, probably worried sick about his mother. My son, who'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to help support us. My son, who'd noticed what I'd missed. My son, who'd tried to save me. I thought about Rosa, my neighbor from the floor below. Sweet Rosa, who'd invited me for coffee countless times over the years. Rosa, who'd offered to help when I was sick. Rosa, who'd smiled at me in the hallway and asked about my health with genuine concern. All the love and care I'd been starving for was right there, waiting for me. But I'd been so focused on trying to earn affection from someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial burden that I'd missed it completely. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to stop pretending. Stop pretending that this marriage was salvageable. Stop pretending that Richard cared about me. Stop pretending that I deserved to be poisoned slowly to death. I was going to fight back. When Richard handed me my morning pills, I smiled at him. "Thank you, honey," I said sweetly. Then I walked to the bathroom and flushed them down the toilet. For the first time in months, I didn't swallow poison with my morning coffee. It felt like rebellion. It felt like revolution. It felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. David came over that afternoon with information he'd gathered from the internet and from calling the pharmacy. We sat at the kitchen table while Richard was out, planning what would have seemed impossible just days before: my escape. "We need to get you to a doctor first," David said, his work-roughened hands holding mine. "Get blood tests. Document what he's done to you." "Then what?" I asked. "Then we call the police." The word hung between us. Police. It made it real, final. There would be no going back from that. "Mom, he tried to kill you," David said softly. "He's been slowly poisoning you for months. That's attempted murder." I knew he was right, but 32 years of marriage don't die easily, even when they should. "What if I'm wrong?" I whispered. "What if there's some explanation?" David pulled out his phone and showed me the pictures he'd taken. The fake pills next to images of what my real medication should look like. The research he'd done about what those fake pills actually were. Over-the-counter sleep aids mixed with something else. Something that would cause the exact symptoms I'd been experiencing. "You're not wrong, Mom. And you're not crazy. And you don't deserve this." That afternoon, we drove to the emergency room at Queen's General Hospital. I felt like I was betraying Richard somehow, even though he'd been trying to murder me. 32 years of being trained to put his needs before my own doesn't disappear overnight. But as I sat in that sterile waiting room, watching David fill out paperwork, something shifted inside me. I wasn't betraying anyone. I was finally taking care of myself. The doctor who saw me was a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. Dr. Patel listened to everything, about the pills, about my symptoms, about my suspicions, without judgment or disbelief. "Let's run some tests," she said. "Blood work, urine analysis, everything we can think of. If someone has been giving you medication you weren't supposed to have, we'll find evidence of it." The next few hours passed in a blur of needles and questions and forms. David stayed with me the whole time, holding my hand during the blood draw, making jokes to calm my nerves, being the kind of loving, supportive family member I'd forgotten existed. When the results came back, Dr. Patel's face was grim. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "your blood shows traces of several substances that shouldn't be there. Compounds that would definitely cause the symptoms you've described. Dizziness, confusion, irregular heartbeat, nausea, all consistent with what we're seeing in your system." I felt vindicated and heartbroken at the same time. I'd been right. David had been right. Richard had been poisoning me. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Now," Dr. Patel said, "we document everything. We get you on the correct medication. And we strongly recommend you contact law enforcement." That evening, back in our tiny apartment, I sat looking at the evidence spread across our kitchen table. Blood test results, pictures of the fake pills, printouts about my real medication, phone numbers for lawyers and police departments. Richard walked in just as David and I were discussing our next steps. "What's all this?" he asked, glancing at the papers with what looked like annoyance. "The truth," I said simply. His face went very still. "What truth?" I held up the blood test results. "The truth about what you've been doing to me. The truth about the pills. The truth about everything." For a moment, I thought he might deny it. Might try to gaslight me one more time, convince me I was imagining things or overreacting. Instead, he laughed. Actually laughed, like the whole situation was mildly amusing. "You figured it out," he said, sitting down at the table as if we were discussing dinner plans. "Took you long enough." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. David stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" "Sit down, son," Richard said calmly. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me? You tried to murder my mother." "I tried to solve a problem," Richard corrected. "Your mother has been nothing but a drain on this family's resources for years. The medical bills, the constant doctor visits, the medications, the endless complaining about every little ache and pain. Do you know how much money we could have saved if she'd just moved on? Moved on. Like I was a temporary inconvenience rather than his wife of 3 decades. And the life insurance would have helped," he continued. "Not much, maybe $50,000, but enough to make things easier. Plus, I could finally have some peace and quiet around here." I stared at this man I'd shared my life with, trying to find any trace of the person I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The young man who'd held me when I cried about my mother's illness. The father who'd stayed up all night when David had pneumonia as a toddler. The husband who'd once promised to love and protect me until death parted us. He was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed at all. "You're sick," David said, his voice shaking with rage. "You're actually sick." "I'm practical," Richard replied. "Your mother is old, she's expensive, and she's only going to get worse. I was doing everyone a favor." That was the moment my grief transformed into something else entirely. Something powerful and clean and unstoppable. I stood up. "Get out," I said quietly. Richard looked at me with surprise. "Excuse me?" "Get out of this apartment. Get out of my life. Get out now, before I call the police and have you arrested for attempted murder." "You can't throw me out. This is my home too." "Actually," David said, pulling out more papers from his folder, "the lease is in Mom's name. Has been since 2018, when your credit got so bad they wouldn't let you sign anything. Legally, she can absolutely throw you out." I hadn't known that. In all the chaos and confusion of recent years, I'd forgotten that my name was the only one on our lease agreement. Richard's confident facade cracked slightly. "Margaret, be reasonable. You can't survive on your own. You need me." "I need you?" I looked at him with something approaching pity. "Richard, you've been systematically poisoning me for months. You've been planning my death. The last thing I need is you." I walked to our small closet and pulled out an old suitcase. "You have 1 hour to pack whatever you need and leave. After that, I'm calling the police." "You won't do it," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You don't have anywhere else to go. You don't have any money of your own." That's when David spoke up. "Actually, she does." He handed me another set of papers, bank statements, investment records, Social Security information. "I've been helping Mom organize her finances," David said. "Turns out, she's been supporting this family almost entirely on her own for years. Her Social Security, her small pension from the grocery store, the savings account she's been contributing to for decades. She doesn't need you, Dad. She never did." I stared at the numbers on the papers. I'd lost track of our finances when Richard took over managing them, but seeing it laid out clearly was shocking. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't destitute either. I had enough to live comfortably on my own, to pay for my medical care, to maintain my independence. He'd made me feel poor and dependent when I was actually the one keeping us afloat financially. The lies just kept multiplying. Richard packed his bags in sullen silence. I watched him move around our apartment, this space we'd shared for 5 years, gathering his clothes and personal items. It felt surreal, like watching the end of a movie I'd never wanted to see. "You'll regret this," he said as he stood at our front door with his suitcase. "You think you can make it on your own, but you can't. You'll come crawling back within a week." I looked at him. really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. This man who'd convinced me I was worthless, who'd made me feel like a burden, who'd literally tried to kill me for insurance money. "Goodbye, Richard," I said simply, and I closed the door. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. No criticism, no demands, no undercurrent of resentment or barely concealed disgust. Just peace. David stayed with me that night, sleeping on our small couch, making sure I was okay. We ordered Chinese food from the restaurant downstairs and ate it sitting on the floor, talking and laughing like we hadn't done in years. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said as we cleaned up the empty containers. "I know this was scary, but you did it. You saved yourself." For the first time in months, I slept through the night. No coughing, no racing heart, no confusion or dizziness. My body was already beginning to heal itself now that I wasn't being poisoned daily. But I knew Richard wouldn't give up easily. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. I was right. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Richard, calling to tell me he'd forgiven me for my little tantrum and was willing to come home. "I know you didn't mean it, Margaret. You were just confused because of your medication. Come pick me up and we'll pretend this never happened." I hung up on him. He called back immediately. "Don't hang up on me again. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but you're making this difficult. You can't just throw away 32 years of marriage because of some misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. He was calling attempted murder a misunderstanding. I blocked his number. Then he started showing up at my building, standing outside on the sidewalk, looking up at my window, sometimes for hours. The doorman, Mr. Rodriguez, called up to warn me. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband is downstairs again. Should I let him up?" "No," I said firmly. "And if he becomes threatening or refuses to leave, please call the police." After 3 days of this harassment, I knew I needed to take legal action. David helped me contact a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in domestic abuse cases. Her office was small but comfortable, filled with books and plants and pictures of her family. "Tell me everything," she said, settling back in her chair with a yellow legal pad. So I did. The poisoning, the financial manipulation, the emotional abuse, the isolation, the threats. Everything. "Mrs. Harrison," she said when I finished, "what your husband did isn't just abuse, it's attempted murder. We need to file criminal charges immediately." The thought terrified me. Taking Richard to court, testifying in public about our private hell, exposing our family's shame to strangers. But the alternative was letting him get away with it. Letting him do this to someone else someday. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "First, we file a restraining order. Then we work with the police to build a criminal case. The evidence you and David have gathered is excellent. Blood tests, medication analysis, documentation of his threats and admissions." That afternoon, we went to the courthouse in downtown Queens. The building was imposing and cold, all marble and echoing footsteps. I felt small and old and out of place. But Patricia guided me through the process with patience and kindness. We filled out forms, submitted evidence, met with a judge who granted a temporary restraining order. Richard was now legally prohibited from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my home. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I got a call from my landlord. "Mrs. Harrison, I hate to bother you, but I've received some concerning phone calls about you. Someone claiming to be your family member says you're having mental health issues and can't be trusted to live alone safely." My blood ran cold. "They're saying you've been making false accusations against your husband, that you're confused and possibly dangerous to yourself and others. They're requesting I do a welfare check on you." Richard. It had to be Richard, trying a new angle of attack. "Mr. Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I'm fine. I'm not having any mental health crisis. I recently left an abusive marriage, and my ex-husband is now harassing me and trying to discredit me." I figured it might be something like that, Mr. Peterson said kindly. You've been a model tenant for 5 years, but these calls were quite insistent. I wanted to give you a heads up. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen shaking. Richard was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. If he succeeded, he could potentially have me committed somewhere, take control of my finances, maybe even get legal guardianship over me. The thought was more terrifying than the poisoning had been. I called Patricia immediately. "This is escalation," she said grimly. "He's trying to discredit you before the criminal case goes to trial. We need to move faster." Over the next week, Patricia and I worked around the clock to build our case. We got statements from Dr. Patel about my medical condition and the poisoning. We documented Richard's phone calls and harassment. We gathered character witnesses who could testify to my mental competence. David took time off work to help, driving me to appointments, organizing paperwork, making sure I wasn't alone when I felt overwhelmed. Rosa from downstairs became an unexpected ally. When she learned what had happened, she was outraged. "That man!" she said, setting down a container of homemade soup on my small table. I knew something was wrong. I could hear him yelling sometimes. "See how sad you looked in the hallway. I should have said something sooner." "It's not your fault," I assured her. "I hid it well." "Too well," Rosa said firmly. "But no more hiding, okay? You're strong, Margaret. Stronger than you know." Rosa's friendship became a lifeline during those dark weeks. She'd check on me every day, bring me food, sit with me when the loneliness felt overwhelming. She reminded me that not all love came with conditions and costs. The criminal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November. I woke up that day feeling like I might throw up from nerves. This was it. My chance to tell my story officially, to hold Richard accountable for what he'd done to me. David picked me up early, and we drove through Queens in silence. The leaves were changing colors, beautiful reds and golds that reminded me of better times, of seasons when I'd felt hope instead of dread. The courthouse was crowded and chaotic. Patricia met us outside, looking professional and confident in her dark suit. "Are you ready for this?" she asked me. I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. 32 years of marriage, 5 years of increasing abuse, months of being slowly poisoned by the man who'd promised to love and protect me. I thought about Richard's confident assumption that I'd never fight back, never expose him, never find the courage to save myself. I thought about David's whispered "Mom, run" that had started this whole journey. I thought about Rosa's soup and kindness, about Dr. Patel's gentle care, about Patricia's fierce advocacy on my behalf. "I'm ready," I said. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate. Richard sat at the defendant's table with his own lawyer, looking sullen and angry. When our eyes met across the room, he glared at me with undisguised hatred. This was the man I'd loved for 3 decades. This was the father of my child. This was the person I'd sacrificed my health, my finances, and my identity to support. And he hated me for refusing to die quietly. The prosecutor, a young man named James Martinez, presented our evidence methodically. The medical records showing I'd been poisoned, the fake pills Richard had substituted for my real medication, the blood tests proving what substances had been in my system. Dr. Patel testified about the physical damage that had been done to my body. David testified about finding the switched medication. Patricia testified about the pattern of abuse and control. Then it was my turn to take the stand. Walking across that courtroom felt like walking across a bridge from one life to another. Behind me was Margaret, the victim, the woman who'd accepted abuse as the price of love, who'd nearly died rather than fight back. Ahead of me was someone new, someone I was still learning to be. "Mrs. Harrison," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell us about your marriage to the defendant?" And so I did. All of it. The years of emotional manipulation, the financial control, the isolation from friends and support systems. the gradual escalation to physical poisoning. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" the defense attorney asked during cross-examination. It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself hundreds of times. "Because I loved him," I said simply. Because I believed love meant enduring anything, sacrificing everything, accepting whatever treatment I was given. Because I thought my worth was tied to how much I could give and how little I could ask for in return. And when did that change? I looked across the courtroom at Richard, who was staring at me with cold calculation, probably wondering how he could spin this situation to his advantage even now. When I realized he was willing to kill me, I said. When I understood that my love and sacrifice meant less than nothing to him. When I finally accepted that dying wasn't the price I should have to pay for his convenience. The judge delivered his verdict that afternoon, guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder, domestic abuse, and elder abuse. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. "This isn't over, Margaret," he called out. "This isn't over." But it was over. It was finally, completely, absolutely over. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I was floating. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and new possibilities. "How do you feel?" David asked as we stood on the courthouse steps. "Free," I said. And I meant it. But freedom, I was about to learn, comes with its own challenges. The first few weeks after the trial were a strange mixture of relief and disorientation. For 32 years, my life had revolved around Richard's needs, moods, and demands. Even the past few months of fighting him had still been about him, defined by his actions. Now, for the first time since I was 41 years old, I was completely alone. Lonely, but not alone, if that makes sense. I had David, Rosa, Patricia, Dr. Patel, people who genuinely cared about my well-being. But I also had something I hadn't experienced in decades: autonomy. I could eat what I wanted for dinner without worrying about criticism. I could watch my favorite TV shows without someone changing the channel. I could invite Rosa up for coffee without being accused of gossiping or wasting time. I could take my real medication and feel my body growing stronger every day. But I also had to learn how to be Margaret again, instead of just Richard's wife or David's mother. Who was I when I wasn't defined by my relationships to other people? I started small. I bought groceries I actually wanted to eat instead of just whatever was cheapest. I replaced our old, worn bedsheets with new ones in colors I loved. I hung pictures I'd kept stored in boxes because Richard didn't like them. Slowly, my tiny apartment began to feel like my home instead of just a place I happened to live. Rosa convinced me to join a community center art class she'd been attending for years. "You always said you used to like drawing," she reminded me. "When was the last time you did something just for fun?" I couldn't remember. Everything in my life for so long had been about survival, about keeping everyone else happy, about managing crisis after crisis. Fun had been a luxury I couldn't afford. The art class met Tuesday evenings in a bright room at the Queens Community Center. Our teacher, Mrs. Williams, was a retired art therapy specialist who worked with older adults. She was patient and encouraging, never critical or demanding. "There's no wrong way to make art," she said during my first class. "There's only your way." I started with simple pencil drawings, a bowl of fruit, a vase of flowers, my own hands folded in my lap. My fingers were stiff at first, unfamiliar with holding anything except cleaning supplies and medicine bottles. But gradually, as weeks passed, something awakened. I found myself drawing not just objects but feelings. The loneliness of my marriage, rendered in empty rooms and closed doors. The fear I'd lived with, expressed through dark storms and bare trees. And eventually, hope. Sunrise breaking through clouds, gardens blooming, birds taking flight. "Your work is getting stronger," Mrs. Williams observed during a class in January. More confident, more alive. That's exactly how I felt. More alive. Around the same time, I reconnected with Janet, an old friend from my grocery store days. We'd worked together for 3 years, sharing breaks and covering each other's shifts when our children were sick. But when I married Richard, he'd gradually convinced me that Janet was not the right kind of friend for a married woman. I found her phone number in an old address book and called her on a whim one afternoon. "Margaret?" Janet's voice was delighted and surprised. "Oh my God, girl, where have you been? I haven't heard from you in, 15 years? 20, I corrected. And it's been complicated." We met for coffee the next week at a small cafe near my apartment. Janet looked older, of course, but she had the same kind eyes and mischievous smile I remembered. She was widowed now, living alone with 2 cats and a small garden she tended obsessively. "So tell me everything," she demanded over our steaming mugs. "What happened to you? Why did you disappear?" I told her. Not everything, not the poisoning or the criminal trial, but enough. The isolation, the control, the way I'd lost myself in trying to keep everyone else happy. "Oh, honey," Janet said, reaching across the small table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry. I wondered, you just vanished. I called a few times, but that husband of yours always said you were busy or weren't feeling well. He never told me you called. I figured as much. Men like that don't like their wives having independent friendships. Threatens their control." Janet's matter-of-fact understanding was healing in a way I hadn't expected. She didn't judge me for staying as long as I had, didn't ask why I hadn't left sooner. She just accepted that I was here now, ready to rebuild. "You know what you need?" she said as we finished our coffee. "You need to travel. When's the last time you went anywhere just because you wanted to?" I couldn't remember. Maybe never. "Where would you go?" Janet pressed. I thought about it for a moment. In all my years of sacrifice and survival, I'd never allowed myself to dream about places I might want to see, experiences I might want to have. Maybe. "The ocean," I said tentatively. "I've never seen the ocean." Janet's eyes widened. "Never? Margaret, you live in New York. The ocean is 2 hours away." "Richard never wanted to go anywhere that cost money," I explained. "Well, Richard isn't here anymore, is he?" Janet grinned. "Let's plan a trip." That weekend, Janet and I took the train to the Jersey Shore. It was February, cold and windy, but I didn't care. Standing on that empty beach, watching waves crash endlessly against the sand, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Wonder. The ocean was bigger than I'd imagined. Louder. More alive. The salt spray on my face felt like baptism, like washing away everything that had been and making space for whatever came next. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Janet said, standing beside me on the sand. "Incredible," I breathed. We spent the day walking the beach, collecting shells, eating fried clams at a small seafood shack. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after so many years of taking care of everyone but myself. On the train ride home, I found myself planning other small adventures. Maybe a museum visit, or a concert, or a cooking class. Maybe I'd learn Spanish, or take up gardening, or finally read all those books I'd never had time for. The world felt full of possibilities instead of obligations. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came unexpected challenges. In April, I received a letter from Richard's lawyer. He was appealing his conviction, claiming new evidence of my mental instability. He was suggesting that I'd made up the entire poisoning story during a psychotic break, that the blood tests had been contaminated, that I'd switched my own pills in some elaborate scheme for attention. The letter terrified me. What if his appeal succeeded? What if a different judge believed his lies? What if I ended up being the one who was punished? Patricia assured me that his appeal had little chance of success given the overwhelming evidence we'd presented. But the legal process would drag on for months, keeping Richard's presence in my life like a persistent shadow. "He's trying to get back in your head," Patricia warned me during a meeting in her office. "Don't let him. You know the truth. Everyone who matters knows the truth." I tried to follow her advice, but the letter had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Just when I was starting to feel safe, starting to believe I was truly free, Richard was trying to claw his way back into my life. The worst part was the doubt he'd planted. What if I had imagined some of it? What if my memory wasn't reliable? What if I really was mentally unstable? These thoughts spiraled through my mind during sleepless nights, undermining the progress I'd made, the confidence I'd built. It was Rosa who helped me regain perspective. "Margaret," she said one evening as we sat in her cozy apartment drinking tea, "do you remember when you first moved into this building?" I nodded. We'd been desperate to find affordable housing after Richard lost his job. And this tiny apartment was all we could afford. "You looked like a ghost," Rosa continued. "Thin, pale, frightened. You apologized for everything. For making noise walking up the stairs, for getting your mail at the same time as other people, for existing." She set down her teacup and looked directly at me. "Now look at you. You have color in your cheeks. You stand up straighter. You smile. You laugh. You make art. You have adventures. Does that sound like someone who's mentally unstable to you?" She was right. The transformation had been so gradual I hadn't fully noticed it myself, but I was becoming someone new, someone I actually liked. "He's scared," Rosa said firmly. "He's in prison and he's scared, so he's trying the only weapon he has left, making you doubt yourself. Don't give him that power." The appeal process dragged on through the summer, but I didn't let it stop me from living. I took more art classes, went on weekend trips with Janet, started volunteering at a local literacy center. I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. In September, almost a year after Richard's conviction, Patricia called with news. "The appeal was denied," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's over, Margaret. It's really over." I hung up the phone and sat in my sunny kitchen, surrounded by my art supplies and the plants I'd started growing in the windows. David was coming for dinner that evening. Rosa was teaching me to make her famous enchiladas next weekend, and I had a trip planned to visit Janet's daughter in Philadelphia the following month. My life was full. Not full of other people's needs and demands, but full of my own choices, my own relationships, my own joy. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, shuffling around this same apartment in her nightgown, swallowing poison every morning, disappearing a little more each day. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was living now, but that woman had also been braver than she knew. She'd found the strength to listen when her son whispered, "Run." She'd found the courage to fight back. She'd found the determination to save herself. I was proud of her. I was proud of me. Do you know what it feels like to like yourself for the first time in decades? To look in the mirror and see someone worth caring about, someone worth fighting for? It feels like resurrection. That evening, David came over as planned. I cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, and we ate at my small table with candles and flowers from Rosa's garden. "You look happy, Mom," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Really happy." "I am happy," I realized. "For the first time in years, I'm actually happy." "I'm proud of you, you know," David said. "What you did, fighting back, leaving him, taking him to court, that took incredible courage." "I didn't feel brave," I admitted. "I felt terrified most of the time." "That's what made it brave," he said. "Being scared but doing it anyway." After David left, I sat on my small balcony looking out over Queens. The city sparkled in the darkness, full of other lives, other stories, other people finding their way through their own struggles. Somewhere out there might be another woman like I used to be, another person disappearing in their own life, accepting abuse as the price of love, slowly fading away until they're barely there at all. If that person is watching this, if that person is you, I want you to know something. You are worth fighting for. You are worth saving. You are worth more than the crumbs of affection they're giving you in exchange for your entire life. You don't have to stay small to make others comfortable. You don't have to accept poison as medicine. You don't have to disappear to keep the peace. You can run. You should run. And when you do, you might discover what I discovered. The person you save will be your most beautiful self. 2 years have passed now since that morning when David whispered, "Mom, run," in my ear. 2 years since I stopped swallowing poison. 2 years since I chose myself for the first time in decades. Richard is still in prison. I don't think about him much anymore, except sometimes as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how low I was willing to go, how much I was willing to accept, how close I came to dying for someone else's convenience. My apartment is bright now, filled with art and plants and the sound of laughter when friends come to visit. I have a life that feels like mine, days that unfold according to my choices rather than someone else's demands. David is thriving in his career, engaged to a wonderful woman who treats him with the respect and love he deserves. He's learned from watching my transformation what healthy relationships should look like. Rosa and I take art classes together, travel to museums, try new restaurants. Our friendship is a gift with no strings attached, no hidden costs, no carefully calculated exchanges. Janet and I talk every week and take monthly adventures, small trips that feed my soul and remind me that the world is full of beauty I'd forgotten existed. I am 75 years old, and I am just beginning to live. Some people might say I wasted 32 years of my life in that marriage, but I don't see it that way. Those years taught me what I don't want, what I won't accept, what I'm worth. They made me appreciate freedom in a way I never could have otherwise. And they led me to this moment, this life, this version of myself that I'm still getting to know and learning to love. Every morning now, I take my real medication, the pills that help my heart stay strong and steady. Every morning, I make my coffee exactly as I like it. Every morning, I look out my window at the Queen's skyline and feel grateful to be alive. Not just breathing, but alive. Awake. Present. Free. I want to leave you with this thought. It's never too late to save yourself. Whether you're 35 or 55 or 75, whether you've been trapped for months or years or decades, whether the abuse is subtle or obvious or somewhere in between, it's never too late to choose yourself. The courage you need is already inside you, waiting. The strength you need is already there, quiet but unbreakable. The life you deserve is already possible, if you're willing to reach for it. Sometimes all it takes is one person whispering, "Run," in your ear for you to remember you have legs. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of clarity to see that the medicine is actually poison. Sometimes all it takes is one deep breath to find your voice and say, "Enough." Have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever known someone who disappeared in their own life, who accepted less than they deserved, who nearly lost themselves trying to love someone who couldn't love them back? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. You matter. And if this message has reached you at exactly the moment you needed to hear it, if something in my story has awakened something in yours, please like this video and subscribe. Together we can remind each other that it's never too late to stop pretending and start living. The sun is setting outside my window now, painting my small kitchen in gold and orange light. In a few minutes, I'll put on some music and cook myself dinner, something I actually want to eat. Later, I'll work on a painting I've been creating, adding layers of color to what started as darkness, but is slowly becoming something beautiful. Tomorrow, I'll wake up in my own bed, in my own home, in my own life. I'll take my real medication and feel my heart beating strong and steady. I'll make my coffee and watch the city wake up, full of possibilities I'm brave enough to explore. Tomorrow, I'll continue being Margaret. Not Richard's wife, not just David's mother, but Margaret. Complex, imperfect, resilient, free. And that woman is worth every single step of the journey that brought me here. The woman you could become is worth every step of your journey too. Run if you need to. Fight if you have to. Save yourself, no matter what it costs. You deserve a life that feels like your own. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to disappear. You deserve to be free.